Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 4. May to August 1915. Yes, I can help, said Dr. Clarkson, but I must warn you, it may not be as you're expecting. They simply aren't taking healthy young men for home service, and even hospital work in France is unlikely. Most likely you'll be a stretcher bearer at the front, and it is not an easy job nor a safe one. You may even be taking the place of a corpsman who was injured or even killed in the line of duty. A queer sort of peace settled over Thomas. That's just what I want, sir, he said, and it was the truth, though he hadn't thought of it that way before this moment. You see, my brother was on the Albion. Dr. Clarkson was in the army, and as far as the army was concerned, Peter had been his brother. That would be the truth from now on. Oh, said Dr. Clarkson. Oh, I see. I'm dreadfully sorry to hear that. Was he a patient? Thomas shook his head. An orderly, sir. He'd been at the front, an advanced dressing station, but he was on temporary assignment to the Albion. I see, he repeated. So you... Well, naturally. I hope you understand there's not much chance of getting you into his old unit specifically. Yes, sir. I hadn't expected to. All right. Well, why don't we step into the examining room? I'll do your physical examination, and we can get started on the paperwork. While he examined him, Dr. Clarkson asked him a number of questions about his education and his work experience, like a job interview, which Thomas supposed it was, although he'd never had one before where he was stripped to the waist. Unless you counted Philip Crowborough. You're perfectly fit, Dr. Clarkson said while Thomas was doing his shirt back up, and I don't see any difficulties with recommending you. I'm sure you realize that there are many differences between a large house and a medical facility, but there are also some similarities, which should be of some help in finding your way. I hope so, sir, Thomas said, doing up his tie. My brother wrote me every week, so I'd like to think I have at least a bit of an idea of what to expect. More than some, I'm sure, Dr. Clarkson said. It'll be heavier work than you're used to, but they'll take care of that during training. He made a few notes on a form. I'll make a few telephone calls, he decided. Your next step will be to take the papers to the recruiting center at Ripon, but I may be able to do a thing or two to get you through the process more smoothly. Come back tomorrow after lunch, and I'll hope to have everything ready for you. Thank you, sir, Thomas said and took his leave. You seem a bit more yourself, Anna said to Thomas as they sat down to lunch. He'd come down to breakfast that morning, dressed in his off-duty suit instead of his livery, and had said something about an errand in the village. Perhaps the walk had done him some good, brought a bit of color into his face. It's time to stop moving forward, I think, he said. I suppose so, Anna agreed. If it was anyone else, she might have said something about it being what Mr. Fitzroy would want, but Thomas still tended to run out of the room if anyone said Mr. Fitzroy's name. During lunch, he was not exactly chatty, but he did at least look at people when they spoke, which was an improvement, and he ate with more signs of appetite than he'd shown since the sinking of the Albion, too. When they were getting up from the table, Anna heard Miss Hughes say to Mr. Carson, Perhaps we don't need Mr. Wolseley tomorrow night after all. We do, said Mr. Carson firmly. That's right, there were guests coming. It certainly made sense for Mr. Carson to have asked Mr. Wolseley to fill in for Thomas, but knowing Thomas, it could very well be that which had spurred him to pull himself together a bit out of sheer contrariness. She said as much to Mr. Bates when they were in the pressing room later, and he agreed. I expect you're right. Thomas would probably come back from the dead if somebody told him he couldn't.
Whatever helps, Anna said. Of course, he can't be expected to simply get over it, but it can't do him any good to wallow in grief.
No, it's strange to see him looking so gutted. I think I'd be pleased to have him insult me.
Anna wouldn't have said it, but she would have been a bit glad, too.
Did he ever speak to you, before all this, about all of his friends dying?
Mr. Bates raised an eyebrow.
Apparently he has a great many friends that none of us knew anything about, or had. At least half a dozen of them have been killed, and he expects the rest to be any minute. Even before what happened to Mr. Fitzroy, he was having trouble coping. I suggested that you know what it's like.
It may be different for me. Most of them are blokes I haven't heard from since I left the army. I got a letter from someone I haven't thought about in over a decade, and it says, Hope you're well, don't know if you remember so-and-so, but I heard he was killed at such and such.
The one he showed me was pretty much like that.
Anna answered, except for the detail that it had been from the Duke of Barrow, but mentioning that would be nothing more than gossip, so she restrained the impulse.
He said it hadn't been any of his closest friends yet, but several of them over there in harm's way. He spoke of signing up so that he wouldn't be the last of his friends left alive.
Mr. Bates sighed.
Perhaps you should. I know,
he added, holding up a hand to forestall her protests.
It won't suit him, but I don't know how much longer he'll be able to keep out of it, with all this talk of conscription.
It doesn't seem fair,
said Anna,
that he should have to lose Mr. Fitzroy and go himself. Nobody else has to do both.
And some, like her and Mr. Bates, didn't have to do either. Thomas was a little surprised when, as he came down in his off-duty suit after lunch, Carson asked where he was going.
Ripon, he answered. Did it occur to you to ask before planning this outing?
Carson asked. It was almost a relief getting a proper scolding again. I was under the impression you didn't need me today, Mr. Carson. Carson clenched his jaw.
Very well.
When he got down to the village, Dr. Clarkson was discussing something with a nurse, so he waited patiently, wondering a bit if he ought to try to pitch in somehow, to show willing. Probably not, he decided. Everyone seemed to have a clear idea of what they were supposed to be doing, and he'd probably only end up getting in the way. So we just watched, paying particular attention to what the orderlies were doing, making beds, handing out medications, changing bandages. When he'd finished with the nurse, Dr. Clarkson gestured for Thomas to join him in his office, so he did. I have everything ready for you, Dr. Clarkson said, or nearly so. I found out that the training group that's forming up now is meant to supply reinforcements to various established units. So he would be taking the place of someone who'd been killed, or at least injured. I see. That's fine, sir. Well, that being the case, I wanted to ask if you'd like me to put in a word about having you placed with the unit that supports the local regiment, once you've completed your training. Thomas wasn't sure what difference that made, but Dr. Clarkson made it sound as though he were doing Thomas a favor, so he said, That would be kind of you, sir. Very well. He wrote something on one of the forms. It isn't a guarantee. They'll assign you where you're needed, but they do need some replacement men, and the chief medical officer is a friend of mine. He wrote some more. Lieutenant Crawley may be able to keep a bit of an eye on you as well. Thank you, sir. That might come in handy somehow. Dr. Clarkson finished writing, folded the papers, and put them in an envelope. There you are. Take those to Ripon, and they'll handle things from there. I would recommend that you go soon. The training group is due to report the week after next. If it fills up before you've signed on, it may be more difficult to get a place in the next one. I planned to go today, Thomas said. Good. They keep changing the eligibility criteria, you see, even though we have as much need of strong, fit men as any other corps. Thomas got the bus into Ripon and easily found the recruiting center. There was a queue, though not the overly long kind there had been at the beginning of the war. Still, he was left waiting around for quite a while before he finally got his turn with the recruiting sergeant, a red-faced and well-nourished older man. Looking over Thomas's packet of papers, he said, Already had your medical, good. RAMC, you sure you wouldn't rather have the infantry? You've got a new local regiment forming up. You can sleep at home while you train. His tone was jocular, but Thomas sensed a bit of something nasty behind it. No thanks, Thomas said, wondering if you were supposed to call a sergeant sir. He ought to have asked Bates. Artillery! You look like you've got a good arm on you. I'm pretty much set on the RAMC, he said. Set yourself. The sergeant had Thomas sign the forms and take the oath before he smiled like someone who had just reached a punchline of a particularly unpleasant practical joke and said, I hope you fancy carrying a stretcher at the front. There's no cushy hospital jobs going for fit young men. That is just what I fancy, Thomas informed him. That clearly wasn't the response the sergeant was expecting. He bit back whatever he'd been about to say next. You're sure about that? The boss can't see your little red cross armband well enough to know not to shoot you. Nor care if they did it, hope you know. At least Dr. Clarkson had delivered the warning before he'd committed himself. If anything this man was saying had been news to Thomas, it would be too late to do anything about it. I do know. My brother was killed on the Albion. The man straightened up, muttered, Right then. and briskly got through the rest of the process without any more false affability or poorly concealed nastiness. After telling Thomas when and where to report, it was down near London, giving him his sign-on pay and a tip for the train, and warning him that he'd be arrested if he didn't show up, he offered what seemed like a sincere "Good luck, lad." He got back to the house just in time for tea, which he felt nearly ready for, but before he could go in for it, he ran into a group of maids in the courtyard. Maud, sitting on his smoking crate, weeping hysterically while Anna and Madge hovered over her. "Bloody hell." "Her brother?" he asked Anna, quietly enough that Maud likely wouldn't hear over the sound of her own wailing. Anna nodded. He stood for a moment, paralyzed by the need to do something and the complete absence of any idea what it ought to be. He didn't suppose pouring her a stiff whiskey would be a good idea, even if he had any, and she already had a handkerchief. "Has anybody got her a cup of tea? No? I'll go." He ducked inside, glad for the excuse to escape. There was no tea in the servants' hall, just people standing around talking in low voices about so unexpected and her poor mother. So he ducked into the kitchen. The large earthenware teapot was sitting on the table, steaming gently, while Miss Patmore and Daisy and everyone bustled about trying to simultaneously set out the rest of the meal and talk about how sorry they were for Maud. He had little trouble snagging a cup, but when he started to pour, Miss Patmore shorted,
"Oi! What do you think you're doing?"
If the well of sympathy hadn't dried up before, it certainly had now. "Getting Maud a cup of tea," he answered, "unless somebody else is doing it."
"Oh,"
said Miss Patmore, and brought over the sugar bowl to put in several spoonfuls.
"you're right. There's nothing like a cup of hot, sweet tea when you have bad news."
Thomas wasn't sure he'd go that far, but he certainly didn't have any better ideas. He took the tea out to Maud, who blinked up at him wetly, but at least had the strength to take the cup in her own 2 hands. Tea safely delivered, he took a few steps back from the huddle of women and lit a cigarette. In Maud's place, he'd have wanted to be left alone. He knew that for a fact. But it wasn't as though she'd be alone even if he left, and he couldn't smoke in the servants' hall since O'Brien was in there.
"I just don't know what to do,"
Maud was saying.
"How could this happen?"
A month ago, it would have been about all Thomas could do not to point out that the death of a badly wounded soldier in wartime could hardly be a massive surprise. But he knew better now. That kind of news was a shock no matter how much warning you had. You just couldn't make yourself believe it until you had no other choice.
"You must go home and be with your mother," Anna said. "I'm sure Mrs. Hughes will understand."
All right, that was an option for some people. Once Maud had finished her tea, Anna helped her to her feet, saying,
"Why don't you go upstairs with Madge, wash your face, and put a few things in a bag? I'll speak to Miss Hughes. Thomas, you can check the train schedules."
At least there was something he could do that didn't require trying to think of something to say to Maud. After finding out where her family lived, he went to Carson's pantry where the railway timetables were kept. Carson wasn't in there, so Thomas kept a wary eye on the door, ready to explain himself as he copied down the train times. There was one she could catch before dinner if she fancied sitting up on the train half the night. Otherwise, she could leave after breakfast. Over tea and for the rest of the evening, conversation in the servants' hall was dominated by the subject of Maud and her brother, with the dinner party upstairs coming in a distant second. No one was paying much attention to Thomas, or even asked him where he'd been all afternoon. That was something of a relief after the past few days, but it made it difficult to figure out how to say that he was leaving. He didn't want to make some big announcement, as though he expected them all to fuss over him. The next day it seemed even more awkward to bring it up. After all, he'd now been keeping it to himself for a day, and surely they'd wonder why. And he found a weird sort of pleasure in watching the business of the house go on around him, knowing that soon he'd be snipped out of the picture. The day after that, though, he had to face up to the fact that it was time to say something. He'd be leaving in less than a week, and there were a few things he had to sort out. First among them was giving notice. Once he did that, there would really be no need to tell anyone else. Word would get out. So after Carson came back down from serving the upstairs luncheon, Thomas knocked on the door to his pantry, went in, and said, "I'm handing in my notice, Mr. Carson. I've joined up, and I leave Tuesday." Carson raised both eyebrows.
"Are you certain that's a good idea?"
"Yes," he said.
And there wouldn't be much point having second thoughts now. I've already made my oath in taking the king's shilling. Not that there was actually a shilling anymore, but there was an oath. I see. Whoa.
Carson cleared his throat loudly, and Thomas braced himself for a lecture on the subject of his many personal failings and the ways in which they might lead him astray in the army. But instead, Carson stood up, extended his hand, and said, "Good luck." Thomas shook it. "Thank you." By dinner time, everyone in the house knew, including those upstairs. Thomas had been allowed to serve at dinner, and as he was going around with the meat, his lordship said,
"Thomas, Carson has told me that you've joined up."
"Yes, my lord," he said. He was glad they were doing this in the dining room in front of everyone. His lordship could not possibly allude to what he'd said and done in the dressing room last week. "I'll report Tuesday." "Did you join the Duke of Manchester's own?" Lady Mary asked. That was Mr. Matthew's regiment. "No, my lady. R.A.M.C.
"Oh, yes, of course. I'm sure you'll do very well," said his lordship, "and I hope you know that we wish you all the best."
"Thank you, my lord. That's very kind." After dinner, when they were clearing the things away, William asked him how he'd done it.
Do you just go to Ripon and say, I want to join, or is there more to it?
Thomas explained how he'd gone to Dr. Clarkson. "If you don't have something in particular in mind, I think you can just turn up."
I wonder what my dad would think about me joining the RAMC. I mean, it's not exactly dang...
William trailed off.
Sorry, I forgot. "They're not taking healthy young men for hospital work," Thomas said. "Only for jobs at the front." "Right. I guess you wouldn't like that any better than anything else, then."
When he got downstairs, their own dinner wasn't quite ready yet, so he went out into the courtyard for a smoke. He'd just lit up when O'Brien, of all people, joined him. They exchanged nods of greeting, but Thomas wasn't about to be the first one to speak. Finally, when they were about halfway through their cigarettes, she said, "You've done a lot of stupid things in your life, but this one takes the cake." He took a slow drag on his cigarette. "It's nice to know you still care, Miss O'Brien." She scoffed. "They aren't going to let you run home, I hope you know, when you decide that you've made a mistake." "I know," he said. "And if you decide to give up on work and next time some fancy man of yours gets killed, they won't tiptoe around you for a week. They'll tie you to a post in no man's land for the Huns to shoot at. That's what they do." Did they really do that? "Wasn't planning to." "I'm not lying to you," she said. "Malingering, that's what they'll think. Or worse, if they decide it's cowardice, they'll shoot you themselves." "I'm not a coward," he said automatically. "No," she said, looking at him with what he was surprised to realize was pity. "I don't suppose you are." She dropped her cigarette and walked off. When they sat down to dinner, Anna squeezed his arm and asked,
"Thomas, are you sure about this?"
"Why did everyone keep asking that?"
"Yes," he said curtly.
"I'm not saying it isn't the right thing to do," she said, "but wouldn't it be better to wait a month or two until you're more—"
She trailed off. "Oh no," Bates said from her other side. She turned to him and Bates said something too quietly for Thomas to hear. When she turned back to Thomas, Anna had plastered on a smile and said,
"I'm sure you'll do brilliantly."
"I'm sure he will,"
added Miss Hughes. There was an awkward murmur of agreement, followed by an even more awkward silence, which was finally broken by Madge asking,
"Will you be seeing David, do you think?"
Glad to talk about something other than whether or not it was a good idea for him to join up, Thomas answered in some length. "Well, I don't know. Dr. Clarkson said he'd put in a word about having me posted near the local regiment once I've done training, but it's a big war, and they could send me anywhere."
"You don't just go to the local regiment automatically, like?"
asked Daisy, who was bringing more bread. "No, well, not the training group I'm in, apparently. We're meant as reinforcements for the different units that need them." Which was just as well, really. Peter had gone over with his training group, but he did make friends so easily. Had made friends easily. Thomas would probably be glad of a fresh start once his training was over.
"Reinforcements?"
said Daisy.
"What does that mean? Is it, like,
She bit her lip. Thomas hesitated, and Bates answered.
They could need men to fill in for any sort of reason. If someone got transferred or promoted, for example.
Daisy's face glared. Oh, I see. Well, that's all right then. At the head of the table, Carson cleared his throat and introduced a new subject. When Thomas went out for his after-dinner cigarette, he wasn't terribly surprised that Bates joined him. Bates, he was sure, would have an opinion about what he'd decided to do. He was surprised when Bates took a cigarette from the pack Thomas offered out of politeness. He must have smoked before, in his war maybe, because he didn't choke on it like Madge had. Without preamble, Bates said, "Well, it's done now, so there's no point second guessing it." At least someone realized that. He went on, "Just keep your head down and get through it, all right? Don't do anything stupid." "I wasn't planning to." Bates nodded. "And try not to be a complete tit to the men in your unit, all right? You want them watching your back." Thomas nodded. "You're going to be bored, a lot of the time, if you're lucky. Don't go stirring up things just to keep yourself entertained." Just before Thomas had left home for his first job at Lady Waterstone's, his dad had attempted a sort of man-to-man talk. It had mostly been about wearing clean underwear and not stealing or seducing maids. It wasn't sure why it was thinking of it now. "Right," he said. "I'll write to Anna. She'll worry about you." "I hope you didn't find Thomas's news too depressing," Cora said as they were getting into bed. "Why would I?" In fact, considering that just last week Thomas had said that he'd considered joining the army tantamount to suicide, Robert found it fairly unsettling. But Cora couldn't know that. All he'd told anyone was that Thomas had been overwrought and Robert had sent him to rest. "Because he's going to the war and you aren't." She looked at him with a sympathetic expression. "Oh, that." "It's to be expected," he said. "All the young men are going. Matthew, Thomas, most of the outdoor stuff. William and Branson will probably join up before long." "Let's hope it's all over before they have to," she suggested. Robert made a non-committal noise. The War Office was being optimistic in its public statements, but in private they were preparing for a long, hard slog. The spring offensives certainly hadn't made much progress, and if anyone had new ideas for the summer ones, Robert hadn't heard a whisper of it. The next day, Miss Hughes was in her sitting room, working on the household accounts, when Thomas knocked on the door. She greeted him with the warmest smile she could manage. Anna and the other girls had expressed doubts about his going into the army, doubts that she shared, but there was no use voicing them now when he couldn't back out even if he wanted to. Instead, she simply asked if there was anything she could do to help. "Yes, as a matter of fact," he said. "I was wondering if you would be all right if I leave my trunk here. You're only supposed to take what you can carry, you see. I'll put it up in the attic so it's not in anyone's way, and then, well, if I don't come pick it up at war's end, you could just get rid of it." He said it so matter-of-factly that Miss Hughes might not have noticed that what he was really saying was that he had no home where his belongings could be kept while he was away, nor anyone who'd care to collect them if he was killed. Might not have noticed, that is, if her attention hadn't already been drawn to the fact when he'd been so lost in grief and had nowhere to go where he'd be looked after.
"Certainly," she said. "But I hope you mean to write to us while you're away, and not simply leave us to wonder how you're faring until you turn up out of the blue when it's all over."
Thomas looked a little startled, but nodded. "Of course, if you'll write back."
"Oh, wait. In fact, you'll be doing a favour to let me. Miss Patmore has her nephew, and Miss O'Brien her brother, but I've no one at the front to worry over."
"Well, we wouldn't want you to be left out."
He managed something that looked almost like a smile.
"You can even send me biscuits if you really want to."
"I'll do that as well,"
she promised. Thomas was in the pressing room, ironing his clothes before packing them away for the duration. It was a fairly pointless thing to do. They'd only get creased sitting in the trunk. But Carson hadn't given him any work to do, and he might as well do something. Anna came in.
"Miss Hughes tells me you're leaving your things here."
He nodded. "There's a tin box with a lock on it I keep my letters in."
He thought about burning them, but he couldn't bear it. He decided to take the last one with him, folded up and tucked behind Peter's photograph in the new cigarette case he'd bought.
"If I don't come back for it, might be best just to chuck that away unopened like."
She nodded.
"If you don't come back?" Thomas, I hope you don't think I'm speaking out of turn.
He raised an eyebrow. They'd already talked about how there was no point trying to convince him he'd made a mistake signing up.
I know you never talk about your family.
That's right, I don't.
But if there's anyone still living, I think you ought to let them know you're going. Even if you've quarrelled, even if they've been unkind. In case you don't come back. So they know that if they want to mend fences, there's the time to do it.
Thomas sighed. It's not how you think. They don't even know about that. He never told anyone this apart from Peter. Now that Peter was dead and didn't know it anymore, perhaps someone else should know. My mum's dead and...
Oh,
said Anna. She was a lady's maid, my mum. She was travelling the continent with the lady she worked for. The Grand Tour, you know. Went everywhere. France, Spain, Italy, Greece. She used to tell me bedtime stories about it. Anna nodded. The moment they got back, she quit a job, ran home, and married the man who had asked her before she left. He hesitated. 4 or 5 months later, I was born, weighing something close to 8 pounds.
Oh,
Anna said again. He nodded. So I've always been a bit of a bastard. Dad wasn't all pleased, as you can imagine. I think he tried not to take it out on me. Looking back, Thomas thought that. Growing up, he just hated him. But he wasn't very good at it, especially after Alice and Jamie had been born. Before that, he might have just not liked kids.
Did you know?
She asked. Not until I was about school-leaving age. Before that, he'd only known that there was something about him that his father didn't like. Mum was dying then. Cancer. So she had to tell me. So I'd understand why it wasn't realistic to think I'd be taking over the shop from him one day. It was that part of it that had hurt the most. He loved the shop. Loved the tick of the clocks, the felt trays Dad used to lay out the pieces when he took them apart. Loved the way all the pieces inside fit together so neatly, like a jigsaw puzzle. Most of all, he had loved the way that sometimes, when they were working quietly together, Dad would forget he didn't like him. Jamie didn't care at all about the shop or clocks, and couldn't be trusted to take apart even the simplest ones without losing half a dozen pieces under the workbench. The idea that the shop would one day be his had felt obscene. That was just too much to ask, you know, especially when he had a son who was actually his. He hurried away from the subject of the shop. She never told me who he was, my actual father. I used to imagine him turning up, you know, like Great Expectations. But I imagine it was actually something fairly sordid. No Italian count, certainly. Maybe the Count's valet, at best. At best, she'd been seduced and abandoned. At worst, assaulted. So she died. I got a job in London, and a few months later he remarried. Alice, my sister, half-sister, wrote to me for a while, but... He shrugged. Dad and the new Miss Barrow started having kids. Alice and Jamie started calling her Mum, and nobody really needed to spell it out. We just fell out of touch. So yeah, I've got a half-sister and a half-brother living, far as I know, but they probably barely remember I ever existed. Anna looked at him for a moment.
I still think you should at least consider writing to her,
she finally said. Thomas shrugged. I don't see the point. Either she wouldn't care, or if she did, it would just upset her.
Well, she said, you know best.
I don't even know if she's still living at home, he added, or if she's still called Barrow. Though the shop wasn't likely to have moved, and Dad would know where she was, if he wanted to write to her, which he didn't. But when Thomas sat down to write letters to the people who'd want to know he'd joined up, after he'd finished ones for Theo and Reg and Joey, and a quick note to Lizel, she'd written back with condolences to his one about Peter, he found himself writing, Dear Alice, hope you're well. It's your brother Thomas, if you don't recognize my writing anymore. How are you and everyone? I'm writing because I've joined up and somebody I know pointed out that you might like to hear from me before I go. I report for training Tuesday, but I will be in England for at least a couple of months. Thomas lit a cigarette and read over what he had written. It was all right, he decided. It didn't make it sound like he was expecting anything, which he wasn't,
It might be a bit short, though, so he added, I'm going into the medical corps as a stretcher bearer, which I hear is hard work, but interesting and worthwhile. Lately I have been working as a footman, so it will be a big change. That was probably enough. He was using small paper, so it took up most of the page. He considered how to sign it.
Definitely not.
Affectionately yours. Your brother would have been good, but he'd already said that. Finally, he just wrote his name at the bottom and stuck it in the envelope. When Thomas got up from the servants' hall table and unceremoniously went out for a cigarette, Anna, just as unceremoniously, went with him. It might very well be his last one, at least his last evening one, at Downston, since it was getting on for bedtime and he was leaving in the morning. She'd been doing her best to keep a cheerful face on things ever since Mr. Bates had explained to her that Thomas no longer had any choice about whether he went or not, having been sworn in.
The worst thing we could do right now is encourage any doubts you might be having,
Mr. Bates had said. He had also said that once Thomas was with his unit, they'd all encourage each other along. She hoped he was right, and that Thomas would let them. But now that it was her last chance, she allowed herself to say,
You will be careful, won't you? Look out for yourself.
When don't I?
He asked lightly. The last couple of weeks, for one. And that was why she worried, that he might not look out for himself because he didn't really want to. But she couldn't say that.
I'll write to you, all our news, she said instead. And you must tell me if there's anything you'd like me to send.
She knew he'd sent large and frequent parcels to Peter, though exactly what had gone into them, besides the scarf he'd made at Christmas, was something of a mystery. He nodded.
I'll be all right.
He took a long pull from his cigarette.
I just couldn't,
he said abruptly.
Go on as if everything was normal. It'll be better to
make a clean break of it,
Anna suggested, when it seemed he wasn't going to finish the thought.
Yeah,
he said.
And not to have to figure things out for myself. I'll just go where they tell me to go and do what they tell me to do. Keep my head down.
That didn't sound much like the Thomas she knew, but it did at least sound like he wasn't planning to do anything reckless.
That's probably best, she agreed. And it is the right thing, really. Joining up.
They'd have got me before long whether I wanted to go or not, Thomas said. This registration scheme they're talking about is the first step toward conscription, and you can bet footman isn't going to be considered an essential occupation.
That hadn't been precisely what she meant, but she nodded.
I suppose we women will be taking on more than men's work with everyone going.
Thomas huffed.
It'll take more than a war for Carson to allow maids in the dining room, he said. You might want to learn to polish silver, though.
I expect I'll be able to pick it up, she said. Madge has heard that some of the houses near here have got girls working in the gardens. And the stables, where they still have horses.
Thomas gave her a skeptical look.
Mr. Bassett won't hear of it here,
she added, naming the head gardener.
Though apparently one or two have applied.
Can't really see that working out either.
Now it was her turn to give Thomas a skeptical look.
If a woman can carry a basket full of sopping wet laundry, I expect she can manage a wheelbarrow and a spade.
Yes, but they haven't got lavatories out in the gardens, he pointed out. They just step behind a tree.
Anna hadn't thought of that.
Well, I imagine they can think of something.
Any other man, she reflected, would have talked around the subject, saying at most something about ladies' particular needs or modesty. She really was going to miss him. Thomas had wondered a bit if finding himself in situations that he recognized from Peter's letters would keep Peter painfully in his thoughts. Fortunately, he found himself too busy and too tired to indulge in recollection much, and when something did remind him of Peter, it was with the sense that now he was coming to understand the last chapter of Peter's life. The only time he had a bit of a wobble was when a letter came forwarded on from Downton from Peter's unit. It wasn't his writing, but Thomas felt a stab of irrational hope, and his hands shook as he opened it. It read, Dear Thomas, I want you to know how goddamn sorry we all are about your brother. He was one of the best of us, and we're all gutted. He had a lot of friends in our outfit, and I had the honor of being one of them. Without him, I would have found the army a much lonelier place.
I happen to be a Jew, you see, and while most of the others were willing to overlook this deficiency as long as I didn't draw attention to it, Fitz was the first who didn't seem to find it embarrassing if I happened to mention, for instance, a holiday or my father's profession. He is a sort of clergyman in our faith. His easy acceptance was not only a comfort to me, but him being such a popular fellow, led the others to accept me too. One of the best things about him was the way that he could make the best of even the most rotten situation. He wouldn't pretend there was nothing wrong. That sort of false cheer is so irritating in the conditions we're in. But he'd find the right thing to say to help us through it. When we were first started out in the wards at General 11, he would often say, "We'll never have to do that for the first time again." I still say it to myself. I was also with him on the Albion, and I can tell you that he died very bravely. He made it to the rescue boat several times carrying stretcher cases, but each time he went back for another. We all knew that the ship was going down quickly, and some of the others made excuses to linger once they'd reached safety, but not Fitz. We had no time to talk then, you understand, but I'm sure that if we had, he would have said, as he so often did when we drew a rotten assignment, that someone had to do it, and there was no particular reason it shouldn't be us. We still say that too. In my faith, instead of saying, "May he rest in peace," we say, "May his memory be a blessing." Fitz's memory is a blessing to me and to all of us here, as I'm sure it is to you. Sincerely yours, Isaac Shapiro. His eyes stinging and his throat aching, Thomas tucked the letter behind the photograph in his cigarette case and shoved the lot deep into his pack. The next time he wanted a cigarette, he walked over to the YMCA hut and bought new ones. As Peter had said, the first weeks were taken up mainly with marching, calisthenics, and drill. He'd been a bit hesitant about the latter. Being ordered about like a dog seemed a bit humiliating in principle. But when the time came, he found he didn't mind it. You sort of switched your mind off, becoming an anonymous piece in a machine made up of men's bodies. In a way, it was almost relaxing, and the level of precision required reminded him of nothing so much as serving in the dining room with Carson watching for the slightest misstep. The shouting did require a bit of getting used to, but it wasn't all bad, having what you'd done wrong shouted out at the moment you did it. It certainly beat having Carson standing across the room trying to communicate the nature of your sin through eyebrows alone. And with so many of you, the sergeants didn't seem to have time to hold routine mistakes against you, unless you'd managed a really spectacular cock-up. It was forgotten almost as soon as you'd done it. Some things were different from what Peter had described. They trained mostly in platoons of 50, but were housed in sections of about a dozen in small bell-shaped tents that reminded Thomas of pictures he'd seen of Red Indian teepees. There wasn't much barracks cleaning to do, because they slept rolled up in their ground sheets and blankets. All you had to do in the morning was roll everything up neatly. As Bates had advised, Thomas kept his head down and didn't make trouble for himself. When early on the section had started talking about why they joined up, Thomas had trotted out the story about his brother on the Albion, since it had seemed to go over well before. The other blokes were suitably solemn and impressed about it, and once in a while Thomas explained something that they were wondering about by saying, "My brother said that once you're at the front..." He didn't say it often, though. He didn't want to be like Maud, boring everyone with stories about his brother all the time. Most of the conversations he had with his section mates consisted mainly of him nodding and saying things like, "Too right," or "Bloody typical." Thomas knew that he wasn't making friends, which was fine. He didn't want to. But he didn't entirely realize that he hadn't made any enemies either until the day came when his section got an evening pass and he found himself swept along to the pub along with everyone else. Excepting the section's 3 Methodists, of course. No one precisely invited him to join them. It was more that it didn't seem to occur to anyone that he wouldn't go along. Around the same time, he heard one of his tent mates say to a bloke in another section, "Our Dutch just Barrow. Bit quiet, but he's all right." It wasn't a way Thomas had ever thought of himself before, but he supposed it was an improvement on "bit of a bastard," or even "haughty ice prince." And it wasn't a difficult reputation to live up to.
All he had to do was shoulder his fair share of whatever unpleasantness was going around. A silent thanks for Peter to pointing out the importance of this quality. You can even complain a bit without anyone looking at you like you were a dog that had just soiled the carpet, as long as you complained while getting on with it and there were no officers in earshot. No proper commissioned officers, that is, the kind that wore tailored uniforms and got called sir. The non-commissioned ones, the sergeants and corporals, were working-class blokes like the rest of them, and you could complain, smoke, and even swear in front of them as long as you weren't actually on parade or something like that. And even bigger surprise than his mate's easy acceptance of him was that the NCOs didn't seem to have found anything about him to particularly dislike either. In fact, the second time they went out on maneuvers, he was picked to act as corporal and lead his section. This particular role was a bit less of a pretense than some of the other parts there were to play on maneuvers, as you did really have to report to the sergeant in charge about your section, relay the orders back to them, and say who was supposed to do what as you went about accomplishing whatever it was you'd been told to do. The first job they had, once they'd marched to the designated location, was setting up a surgery tent. Thomas half expected, when he started ordering the others about, that they'd double over laughing and ask him what the heck he thought he was playing at, but instead they all just did what he told them. Including the bloke who'd been Lance Corporal last time, and who Thomas thought might be out for his blood. Even when he had to point out that they'd got the instrument cabinets in the wrong order, nobody gave him any back chat about it, just swapped them around. When they got back from maneuvers, he wrote as much to Anna, and she wrote back, June 17th, 1915. Dear Thomas, I'm glad to hear that you're doing so well. I don't know why you're surprised about being Lance Corporal. You've been first footman for years, so you have leadership experience. Mr. Bates says you're right, that they try out different people in the position, so you shouldn't expect to necessarily have it again next time, but they don't give everyone a turn, so they must have had a reason to think you were suited for it. Everyone here is very proud of you. William asked me to say that he feels sorry for the men in your section, but he's only joking. The enclosed letter came here for you. I'm not sure who it's from, but I thought we'd better send it on. I hope it isn't any sort of bad news. Love, Anna Smith. He still wasn't used to getting letters from people who signed their full names, as if they didn't care at all who knew that they had written them. The enclosed envelope bore unfamiliar handwriting, and he opened it with a sense of unease. It said, Dear Thomas, I hope that this manages to reach you, as you will have left for training by now. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. When your letter came, things were rather busy here. Jamie and Alf, my husband, were both getting ready to leave for training as well. They joined the Sheffield Pals, so it was both of them leaving at the same time. Jamie likes to be called Jim, now he's all grown up. We're all very proud of you for joining up as well. Mum and the younger ones send their love, and Dad says that if you can make it back on leave before you go to France, you ought to come by the shop and he'll clean your watch for you. Do you suppose you will make it back? You could come round for tea at Alf's in my flat, if you don't feel up to facing the whole crowd at home. You'd be able to meet your niece, Rosie. She's 2 years old and she's got black hair like yours, but in curls. We also think she's going to grow up to be clever, like you always were. But if you don't have time to visit, we will understand. Love, Alice Barrow Wilkins. Bloody! What was he supposed to say to that? He had nearly forgotten that he'd written to his sister back before he left. He stuffed the letter at the bottom of his pack, but as the ending of their training period grew near, he supposed he had better come up with some kind of answer. Finally, he wrote, Dear Alice, I'm quite chuffed to hear I've got a niece. That was true enough, though he'd be very surprised if she actually resembled him at all. The rest of the family had all been sandy-haired and a bit ruddy. If her coloring was different, it must have come from her father. It certainly couldn't have come from Thomas's. Time for the invitation to tea, but I doubt I'll make it up to Sheffield. My training camp is near London, and rumor has it that we will be leaving in a couple of weeks. You can tell Dad that I've been looking after my watch the way he showed me, and give my best to Miss Barrow and the little ones. He supposed they weren't so little anymore. The eldest had been born a scant but technically respectable year after Mum died, his and Alice and Jamie's actual mum. But he wasn't at all sure how many there were, much less what their names and ages and sexes might have been. He hadn't really kept track, even while Alice had been writing him about them, as they were no real relations of his anyway, and Miss Barrow could very well have had more sense. I'm doing fairly well in training. I will keep an eye out for Jamie and Afe if I run into the Sheffield pals. Not that he'd recognize either of them, particularly Alf, since he'd never laid eyes on him. But it seemed like the sort of thing you were supposed to say. He signed off, Thomas.
"Well, there's a surprise," said Anna. "That letter Thomas got, it was from his sister."
I didn't know he had one,
Mr. Bates answered. They were sitting in the servants' hall after lunch.
"They haven't spoken in quite some time," she explained. "I told him I thought he ought to write to her, tell her that he's joined up. It didn't sound like he thought much of the idea, but he must have done it."
I hope it was a nice letter,
Mr. Bates said.
"It sounds like it was. A couple of lines of nonsense about being proud of me for joining up, he says."
She read from the letter. That probably meant it was a perfectly ordinary, polite letter.
"And he's an uncle. I don't suppose I have to send a christening present, as she's 2 years old, he says."
Makes you wonder if she had his address here,
Mr. Bates noted, picking up as she did Thomas's irritation at not having been told this news earlier. It wouldn't surprise Anna one bit to learn that she hadn't, and that Thomas had completely overlooked that fact.
I'm glad he listened to you,
Mr. Bates added.
as everyone should.
He sighed.
I do worry about him.
Anna did too.
"It sounds like he's doing well,"
she suggested. He could be, and probably was, putting a brave face on things, but she didn't think he'd be capable of writing such ordinary-sounding letters if he was still overwhelmed by his grief. Not that he'd write her about his grief either. He'd just not write at all.
When he gets over there, he's going to need to be sharp. Do you ever wonder if he...
Mr. Bates trailed off without saying anything revealing, but Anna suspected she knew what he was asking. She'd thought it herself. You didn't have to be Dr. Freud to realize that Thomas had joined up in order to, in some way, go where Mr. Fitzroy had gone. It was just a matter of which way he had in mind, experiencing what Mr. Fitzroy had experienced, or something more final. Answering the unasked question, Anna said,
"Before he left, he said something about not being able to go on as before. I hope he meant that he had to make a change, so that he could go on."
Bates nodded.
Perhaps he did.
Thomas really wasn't sure what he was doing here, even as he pushed open the door to the tea shop. He probably wouldn't even recognize Alice, nor she him. She'd written in response to his second letter, asking if she could come and see him one Sunday if he couldn't get away. Thomas had written back quite truthfully that he could put in for a Sunday pass, but you didn't hear until Saturday afternoon whether you'd gotten one or not, so there wasn't much point in making a long journey. He hadn't said that quite a few of the others in his section had had a wife, mother, or girlfriend come down only to spend the afternoon drinking tea alone, while the bloke they'd come to see was kept busy doing drills or on fatigues. Perhaps he should have, because she'd written back saying he should put in for one for the next Sunday hence. He'd done so, figuring it would serve her right if she came all this way for nothing, but when the pass list was read out, his name had been on it. The others had chaffed him a bit about having a secret girlfriend, but had gone quiet when he said it was only his sister. It wasn't until later that he'd realized they'd assumed quite naturally that his sister was also the sister of his brother who'd gone down on the Albion. Rumor had it that they might start receiving their assignments to France as soon as next week, which, if it had been as they thought, would give Alice quite a bit to be worried about. The bell on the shop door clanged, and a dozen women in Sunday best frocks and hats looked up. The place was open on Sundays largely for this very purpose, a respectable place for female relatives to visit men on passes for the training camps. Most of their eyes passed over him and back to their cups of tea in disappointment, but one woman, dressed in a dowdy brown suit and holding an infant on her lap, half stood, beckoning with a free hand. It was Alice, and if he mentally subtracted the rather dated hat, she looked just as she had when she'd been 10 years old and playing with dolls the last time he'd seen her. "Thomas!" she said. My goodness, you've gotten tall! That usually happens, he pointed out, sitting on one of the spindly chairs the establishment provided. I suppose it does. Rosie, darling, she said to the child, this is your Uncle Thomas. She looked at him, wide-eyed, and stuffed several fingers into her mouth. She did, as advertised, have curly black hair. Hello, you, Thomas said. He was saved from having to come up with anything else to say to her by the waitress coming over and taking his order for a cup of tea and a piece of cake. He imagined Peter saying, well, if it's awful, at least you'll have gotten a piece of cake out of it. So, Alice said once the waitress had gone, what have you been up to? Before all this, I mean, she added, gesturing to his uniform. I was a footman, he said, to the Earl of Grantham. Oh, she said. Is he very important, then? Thomas shrugged. I'm sure he thinks he is. He owns a big house, anyway. In London? That's right, the last time he'd written to her, he'd still been in London. Yorkshire. It's near Ripon. She'd likely not have heard of Downton Village or even Thirsk. Neither was very near Sheffield, but she might know Ripon. Oh, she said again. I suppose they must keep you very busy. Depends what's going on. If they're giving a party, certainly. The waitress came back with his tea, and he took a sip. Definitely better than army tea, which he now understood Peter's feelings about. What about you? I mean, what line of work is Alf in, normally? He's a foreman at the button factory, she answered. And I'm working there now. We do buttons for uniform shirts, so it's war work as well as freeing a man for the front. That's why I could only come on a Sunday. I work the other days. Do you like it? Thomas asked. It's harder work than I thought, she said. And I don't like leaving Rosie, but Mum and Belle look after her. Belle? Was he supposed to know who that was? Belinda, she said. Your half-sister. Your half-sister, he said. She drew in her breath sharply. Let's not quarrel about that. There's nothing to quarrel about. She's not my sister. It's a fact. Alice sighed, poking a bit of biscuit into Rosie's mouth. Dad never meant you had to leave right away when our Mum died. Nor that you couldn't come back and see us. I know what he meant. It was time for Thomas to be thinking about finding his own way, he'd said, and he was right. It had been time. It was hard for him too, she said. Which part? Mum dying or pretending he was my father for 14 years? Rosie started to whimper, and for a moment Alice was entirely absorbed in dangling a rag doll in front of her. When the baby finally began to chew on it, she said, Try to think of it from his side. He was very hurt by what Mum did. He knew it wasn't your fault, but... Of course it wasn't. But you were a reminder of it, that's all. He said when I told him I was coming down here to see you, he said he mightn't have minded giving you his name if she had just told him. Let him decide, instead of being tricked into it. His name, maybe, but not the shop. That's still nothing to do with me. No, she agreed. But do you really think you could do any better? If the woman you loved agreed to marry you and then you found out she was... She lowered her voice. Having someone else's child. He wasn't ever going to be in a position to find out, but he couldn't tell her why. And then he thought, what if a French peasant woman turned up on his doorstep with a baby Peter had fathered through some ill-advised experiment? That was scarcely any more likely than the other scenario, but if it did happen, he'd love the baby because it was Peter's. You know what? I think I could, yeah. Well, believe for you, I doubt I could. The waitress appeared, asking if they wanted more tea. Alice said that they did, and when she'd gone, went on, I'm not saying that he couldn't have put it to you better, but he did try. Bully for him, Thomas echoed. They were never going to see eye to eye on the subject of Dad. He wished she hadn't brought it up. Look, does Miss Barrow treat you the same way she does her own kids? Of course not, and I wouldn't expect her to. Imagine you don't know why. Oh. She smoothed Rosie's hair. But didn't Mum explain it? Yes, after 14 years. She looked puzzled. But it wasn't until after she died that Dad said about the shop and you starting to think about some other kind of job. Had you really thought that was it? I knew something was wrong long before that. He could be certain he had, and that he wasn't just remembering things differently in light of what he knew now, because before Mum had told him, he'd been starting to figure out that he was queer, and he thought that might be it. That Dad had sensed it somehow. Don't you remember?
Remember what?
The waitress came back with the tea. Once she'd poured it and left, Alice said,
I suppose he didn't play with you like he did us, but you were older.
2 years older than her, and from the fact he'd been about 7, he could remember being the age she was, and that Dad hadn't liked him then either. Didn't play with me, was always too busy when I wanted something, always came down harder on me, even if we'd all got in trouble together. He didn't even talk to me more than he had to.
You were always closer to Mum,
Alice said. Thomas snapped. And why do you think that is? He shook his head. He treated you two like you were his kids, and me like I was some neighbour's child he wished would go home. It was a relief to finally find out why. Except that understanding it hadn't been anything he'd done, had meant there wasn't anything he could do to fix it either. I don't hate him for it anymore, but that's as far as I'll go.
I didn't know you ever had hated him,
Alice said in a small voice. He does, Thomas had told him before he'd left. You can tell him I don't anymore if you like.
All right,
she said. Now, is there something else we could talk about? Tell me about the button factory, he suggested.
It's not very interesting, I'm afraid. I work in the packing department, so what I mainly do is take a dozen buttons and put them in a box.
She went on talking about the button factory at some length, and she was right that it wasn't very interesting, but it beat talking about their childhood. In return, he told her some not very interesting things about their routine in camp. The most interesting things being not entirely suitable. When they'd finished their tea and were getting ready to leave, Alice said, Will you write me with where to reach you in France? I suppose, Thomas said, if you like.
I would. We shouldn't fall out of touch again.
Thomas wouldn't go that far, but didn't argue, and let Alice hug him. After that, Rosie wanted to hug him too. He wasn't sure why, since all she'd done was look at him wearily while he argued with her mother. So he allowed that too. It was nice meeting you, Miss Rosie, he said as he put her back into Alice's arms. She babbled something back at him and then waved at him over Alice's shoulder until they were quite out of sight.